and it's verse 34b. But before I read 34b, I really need to read the passage that goes with us. And that starts with verse 27. Jesus went out along with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi, and on the way he questioned his disciples, saying to them, "Who do people say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, others say Elijah, others say one of the other prophets." And Jesus continued questioning them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered him and said, "You are the Christ." What a solid affirmation that was. And then Jesus warned them to tell no one about him. And at this point he began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer many things, and to be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and even to be killed, but after 3 days rise again. He was stating the matter plainly, but Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning around and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not setting your mind on God's interest, but on man." And then our text for today, "And he summoned the crowds with his disciples, and he said to them, 'If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it. Whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the entire world if he forfeits his soul? For what will a man give in exchange for his soul? For whoever is ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, the Son of Man will also be ashamed of him when he comes in glory, the glory of his Father with the holy angels.'" He summoned the crowd and the disciples and looked at them, and he spoke very plainly, the gospel tells us, "If anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me." When we talk about conversion, we talk about discipleship, and we talk about obedience, it's really clear that what Jesus is after is not our intellectual assent to who he is. He doesn't need for us to call him Lord, Lord, because as he said, there are demons that do that. What he wants from us is nothing less than simple-minded, pure obedience. And that brings us to this morning's text. Jesus is on his way to be crucified. He knows that. His disciples don't know that yet. But what he's trying to do is clearly and gently as possible, with still speaking with enough force that they understand it, is to tell his disciples and the rest of those happy followers that he's not coming to be put on a throne. He's coming to Jerusalem to be put on a cross. And he states that matter plainly, and not minutes after Peter says, "You are the Christ," he turns around and said, "Now, Lord, you really don't mean that. You don't want to do this, and you can't do..." Because what Peter was wanting was a king. What Peter was wanting was a rock star. What Peter was wanting was a celebrity. And we all know how that is. What Peter was afraid of, what Peter feared, is the same thing we fear. All of us want to be close to Christ. But none of us want to suffer. Of all the things, if I would ask you privately what you're most afraid of, death would be right up there, but suffering would be right up there with it. We have been taught that we won't need to run from suffering. But what Jesus says here, and he says it very plainly, is that if anyone wants to be his disciple, they have to follow. What makes a follower a follower? A follower is one who follows. And what Jesus is saying, do you want to be mine? Do you want to be a disciple? Then you have to follow me. And where I am going, you have to follow. And what he's saying here is, I am going to be, this is the part that always strikes me. He said, he began to teach them that the Son of God must suffer many things. And suffering by itself is not pleasant, ever. We flee from it. But suffering would have been all right. You know, you can have a suffering hero, and everybody likes that. That makes a good story. And he suffers unjustly, and in the end, he rises up and rises above his suffering, and is the hero everybody can applaud. But that's not what Jesus is saying here. Look at what he's saying. He's saying, the Son of God must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and finally be killed. Suffering is one thing, but suffering and rejection is almost impossible for us to wrap our head around. Not only did he suffer, but after he suffered, he was rejected by the very ones he came to save. Do you remember the scene where when he finally, a few days later, he overlooks Jerusalem and he weeps and he said, "Oh, how I wanted to go." And he wouldn't let me. Because his people turned against him and rejected him. And then, after he says that, he very plainly gathers the folks who are with him and he says, "This is not a victory parade, people. I'm going to die. I'm going to die for you. And if you want to follow me, you've got to deny yourself. You've got to take up your cross, and you've got to follow me." That's a hard word for that day. It's an even harder word for us today. Because there's very few of us that have practiced denying ourselves the way we could have and should have. But Jesus said, like he said to the rich young ruler, and this ties in with that so clearly, it's not about our wealth. It's about what we put our trust in. And the Gospels tell us that we, wherever our heart is, there is our allegiance. If we have wealth, we trust that wealth. And if we trust that wealth, we don't trust the one who gave it to us. I'm not going to get into it because it's a different sermon, but that's idolatry. All right? So I don't know how many of us are practicing idolatry this morning, but I want to read a couple of quotes to you that fill this out a little bit. Those who are not following Jesus are not his followers. It's just that simple. Followers follow, and those who don't follow are not followers. To follow Jesus means to follow Jesus into a society where justice rules, where love shapes everything. To follow Jesus means to take up his dream and to work for it. How many of us are following Jesus so closely that we're working to see the kingdom that he prayed for come on earth? Is that what we're doing? Or are we satisfied with what we are and where we are and what we have, and that most of us don't have what we would consider enough? We want more, but we're content. That's not being a disciple of Jesus Christ. Most people in America, when they are exposed to the Christian faith, are not being transformed. They take one step into the door and the journey ends. They're not being allowed, encouraged, or equipped to love or to think like Christ. Yet in many ways, a focus on spiritual formation fits with what a new generation is really seeking. Transformation is a process and a journey. It's not a one-time decision. And so when we talk about the call to conversion and the call to discipleship, we're talking about a lifelong process where we're continually trying to empty ourselves of self and take more of Christ on us. And as we come to communion this morning, we have to understand that communion is not just about the resurrection. Communion is about the cross. The cross that was not gilded and flanked by beautiful candles in a glorious sanctuary. We're talking about a cross of rough wood, much rougher than the cross we have in the front lawn of the church, but a cross made of rough wood, hammered together hastily with spikes, and planted in the middle of the city dump. That's who we say we want to follow. And he says if we want to follow him, then we have to take up our cross. How many of us are willing to follow that far? You know, the early Christians knew what Jesus was talking about because he made it very, very clear. And in the first chapter of Acts, I've pointed to this before, but it needs to be pointed out again and again so that we have no preconceived ideas about what Jesus is saying. In the first chapter of Acts, after his resurrection, before he ascended in heaven, Jesus gathered them all together and he commanded them not to leave Jerusalem, but to wait for what the Father had promised, which Jesus said, "You've heard from me." John baptized with water, but you're going to be baptized with the Holy Spirit not many days from then. And he says, when that happens, you're going to receive power when the Holy Spirit has come upon you. And you shall be my witnesses, both in Jerusalem and in Judea and in Samaria and even to the remotest parts of the earth. He didn't say, I'm going to let you be disciples. I'm going to let you be witnesses. He said, you will be my witnesses when the Holy Spirit comes upon you. And that sounds okay. How many are willing to bear witness to the love of Christ? Yeah, a lot of people are. But the word that Jesus uses for witness there is the word that we get martyr from, martelo. What Jesus is saying there is when the Holy Spirit comes upon you and you really begin to follow me, you will be my martyrs. In Jerusalem, in Judea, and around the world. Jesus never backed off from that statement. If you want to follow me, take up your cross, deny yourself, and follow me. It's not for the weak. It's not for the will-hearted. It's for life. Jesus of Nazareth is always coming